Waiting is an inevitable part of life. It doesn't matter if you're waiting for your coffee order, waiting for the pair of shoes you really want to come back in stock, waiting for test results, or waiting on help while making a big decision. Waiting is tough. When you're waiting, you might feel excited, but you might feel skeptical too, especially when what you've been promised gets delayed. You start to wonder when you've waited long enough. Eventually, you might even give up hope. Sometimes people of faith have to wait on God. While we wait on God, we need to remember that God has a plan. God is faithful, God is listening, and we should never give up hope because God's not given up on us.
Have you ever been disappointed by something you waited a really long time for? I waited my entire childhood for the Star Wars prequels. I remember when I was really young, I'd watch episodes 4, 5, and 6, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and I thought, man, what in the world happened to episodes 1, 2, and 3? Why hasn't George Lucas made these yet? But then when they came out, they were super disappointing. There was all this talk of galactic politics and trade policies, and there was these new characters like Jar Jar Binks that I didn't like, and I really didn't care about Anakin Skywalker as a child. So these movies were kind of a letdown for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I still went to the theater and saw episode 1 like 14 times in the theater, but it was disappointing. Disappointment happened. Sometimes we invest a ton of time and energy anticipating an upcoming experience, a gift, or a win, but then when it finally shows up, it doesn't exactly go like we hoped it would. Life is tough, and life can be pretty disappointing. When you lose a big game, you might feel ashamed. When a loved one gets sick, you might be afraid. When your parents go through a divorce, you might feel really uncertain. And when you make a big mistake, you might feel really defeated. And in all these situations, the crisis is often followed by a time of waiting, a time of uncertainty where you just have to wait. And you might be waiting to feel better or to get a second chance or to see if your situation will improve, or maybe you're waiting to see if God's going to help you. And while you're waiting, you might start to think things like, can God really be trusted? Does God actually care? Does God even really see me? And if God loves me, then why am I still waiting? If you can relate to any of this, I need you to know that you're not alone. I want to introduce you to a character from the Bible who knew a lot about surviving major moments of crisis and disappointment. And if you're familiar with the Bible at all, you probably have heard of the Apostle Paul. Paul spent his whole life following God. As a young man, he was a high-achieving religious student. But his story took sort of its first big turn during the early years of Christianity when the message about Jesus was just beginning to spread. As a religious leader, Paul did not follow the teachings of Jesus. In fact, he believed that followers of Jesus were enemies of God. So he imprisoned and even had endorsed the killing of some Christians. But then Paul had a personal encounter with Jesus that completely changed his life, and he surrendered his life to God. Paul eventually became one of the greatest Christian influencers of all time. He wrote much of what we call the New Testament. He wrote letters to churches, and they got collected and became a big part of what we call the New Testament. And his influence on Christianity is huge. Despite everything good that God had in store for Paul after he had this encounter with Jesus, he still had some moments of difficulty, some crisis, and even some times of waiting in store for him. One of the major ways that Paul was waitlisted during his life was being sent to prison. And you may be thinking, well, that's kind of weird. I don't think about preachers and Christian leaders spending a ton of time in prison, or maybe you do. But for Paul, his life had been changed by Jesus, but that didn't change the religious leaders and the government officials around him. Allowing someone like Paul to spread the message of Jesus was a threat to their power and their control and their understanding of who God was. So they often tried to imprison and sometimes even kill influential followers of Jesus. So Paul spent about 5 years of his life in prison for spreading the message of Jesus. And while he was there, he probably thought things like, God, how am I supposed to fulfill all these plans you have for me while I'm locked up and thrown in prison? Why are you allowing this to happen? Why aren't you stopping these things from happening to me? We can read about one of these occasions in the book of Acts, chapter 16. Acts is a book of the Bible that recounts how the good news of Jesus spread around the world and how the early church began to grow and what happened to some of these key Christian leaders like Paul. Acts 16 tells us about one of Paul's journeys to a place called Macedonia and what happened while he was there with his friend Silas. See, Paul and Silas were traveling to spread the message of Jesus. And in Acts chapter 16, verse 9, it says, a vision appeared to Paul during the night. A Macedonian man was standing there urging him, come over to Macedonia and to help us. So Paul has this vision that Macedonia needs his help, that God is sending him to Macedonia. So they go to Macedonia, and when they first arrive, they encounter a slave. And her owners were exploiting her for money by making her tell people's fortune. And she, in verse 17, we're told that she followed behind Paul and kept crying out, these men are servants of the Most High God who are proclaiming the way of salvation to you. And you may think, great, this woman is going around endorsing them. And so she's drawing attention to them. This is good. But actually, it was pretty distracting and destructive to what they were trying to accomplish. And it annoyed Paul and Silas. So what they do is that Paul turns around and he actually casts out the demonic force that's oppressing her. And because of this, she lost her ability to tell fortunes. And we read more in verses 19 through 24 of Acts 16. But when her owners saw that their hope for profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. See, they were exploiting her for money. And because Paul had released her from this oppression, now she doesn't have this ability anymore, and they're not going to get money from exploiting her. And then it says that they brought the magistrates there, and they're like, hey, these men are throwing our entire city into confusion. In other words, they're causing trouble for us. They're disrupting our way of life and keeping us from making money off of this exploited woman. They're going to disrupt more businesses if we don't stop now. So the crowds join in and attack them. And the magistrates tear off their clothes, and they order them to be beaten with rods. And then after they beat them severely, they throw them into prison, and they command the jailer to put them in stock in the inner cell. So they're in the inner part of the prison with their feet fastened to the floor. And this was a severe punishment for them. After a long journey where God leads Paul and Silas to Macedonia, they face a major crisis. Paul and Silas are beaten, they're thrown in the jail, all because they preached the message of Jesus and they freed this woman who was being exploited. And this chapter clearly tells us that God led Paul and his friends to Macedonia to share the good news. So if God led them there, why did they end up in prison? Did they make a mistake? Did God make a mistake? Did God put them in prison on purpose? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us why God allowed Paul and Silas to be thrown in prison, but it does make it clear that he didn't want them to stay there. Acts 16, verses 25 and 26. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. Now, I don't know how you would spend your time in prison. This probably wouldn't be the first thing I would think to do. But Paul and Silas are sitting there. They're praying and they're singing to God. And the rest of the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, a great earthquake occurred. The foundations of the prison were shaken. Immediately, all the doors flew open and the bounds of the prisoners came loose. So the jailer, he rushes in and he expects all these prisoners to be gone. And he thinks he's going to be in huge trouble. Paul quickly steps in, lets him know that they were all there. So the jailer is overwhelmed by the fact that the prisoners didn't escape. And he notices there's something different about Paul and Silas. Here they are, they're in prison, and instead of complaining or grumbling or cursing him out, they're praying and they're worshiping. And then when they have a chance to escape, they don't. So the jailer took Paul and Silas to his home, and he cleaned them up and he fed them. And Paul and Silas told his family about Jesus. And the jailer's whole family got baptized that night. See, Paul and Silas were interrupted by disappointment and by crisis. And they were waiting for God's rescue. And they understood, even in the darkest moments of their life, that they could still find a reason to worship. Even while they waited and wondered what would happen next, they could worship God. And God shows up miraculously. God rescues Paul and Silas from prison, but that's not the only thing that happened that night. God rescued the jailer and his entire family too. Even while they were waiting for God's rescue, Paul and Silas trusted that God had not abandoned them. And while they waited, they worshiped. And after they were rescued, they get right back to work, telling the good news of Jesus. And I don't know what song Paul and Silas sang, but I wonder if it was something like Psalm chapter 9. Psalm 9, verses 1 and 2 and 9 through 11 say this: I will praise you, Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of all the marvelous things you have done. I will be filled with joy because of you. I will sing praises to your name, O Most High God. Lord is a shelter for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. Those who know your name trust in you. For you, O Lord, do not abandon those who search for you. Sing praises to the Lord who reigns in Jerusalem. Tell the world about his unforgettable deeds. See, even when Paul and Silas were waiting in prison, wondering what God was going to do next, they found a reason to worship. They knew that God could be trusted. They trusted that God was with them, even in this dark place. And they believed that God would be faithful to them no matter what was going to happen. God was faithful to Paul and Silas while they waited in a prison. And while we're waiting, we need to know that God is faithful to us